Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Tuesdays in 10. I'm Molly, and I come to you every week, Tuesday afternoons, to talk about healthcare education topics in 10 minutes or less. This week, we're focusing on grief. Grief doesn't look the same for anybody. There's different stages, there's different times, phases, complexes, all different ways to grieve. And the important thing to know is that there's no right way, right? There's no right way to grieve, to go through stages, to grieve alone, to grieve with people. You know, it's your own experience, and that's a really important thing to know in general and in times like these, that you can't do it wrong. All right, so today we're briefly going to go over the most common stages of grief, which are Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages. And these stages are denial, anger, depression, bargaining, and acceptance. And now we're going to go through those real quick, and I definitely invite you to Google those, to look those up more in depth. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in general. She kind of kick-started our stages, but there's a lot of different material and people that talk about grief looking a lot different. So we're going to go over these real quick and kind of my own interpretation and opinion on stages that aren't necessarily talked about. And so if this doesn't really suit you, take what does from this, toss out the rest, and then kind of guide yourself into whatever research materials, literature that you can find to benefit you in this time and in general. And so with the first stage of grief, we have denial, which is avoidance, confusion, shock from the experience, from the death, what have you. Our second is anger, which can look like frustration, anxiety of the unknown. And I know sometimes you can say, well, I'm anxious, I'm not angry. You don't have to be one or the other. You also don't have to be both, but sometimes anxiety and fear of the unknown can come up in anger. It can look like anger, whatever anger looks like to you. So that's just something to think about if you're feeling any of that kind of, that type of grief or that stage of grief in your own journey, that it might come up as frustration or anxiety and still kind of be that anger stage. Our third stage is depression. That could be feelings of helplessness, isolation, feeling there's no motivation, you can't get out of bed, there's no point to the next day, etc., etc. You know, and an important part of these stages too, I said before, is that this isn't a linear timeline. You aren't saying, okay, well, I wasn't angry yet. I don't feel depressed yet. I can't believe this happened. I can't believe it. And you're sitting in that place of denial for some time. And that's fine. Okay. Like there's no, okay, well, it's been 2 weeks. What's the next stage? Where am I going to? I'm ready to go. And that there's no timeline for grief. And grief really comes in waves. It's really, you can even think of that metaphor of that wave in the ocean, right? You kind of, one day you're feeling really angry, and maybe a couple weeks you're feeling really angry, and then that depression comes in and that wave crashes down and we go back out, right? So I always find that to be a helpful metaphor, but anything that works for you, that helps you to see that it's not this timeline, this straight, okay, well, I did this stage check. And I personally think that that's the most important thing to know if these stages benefit you, or any other kind of grieving cycle or bereavement transition steps. It is that none of those can possibly go in order, because everybody is a different person, and everyone's grieving differently, and everyone's grief is a different experience, right? We have anticipatory grief, we've got disenfranchised grief, complicated grief. So you can't say, oh, well, that person's grieving, but it doesn't look like mine. Not supposed to. So just know that, you know, especially in times like this in our world, we're seeing a lot of grief. If we're experiencing it ourselves, if we're empathetic to someone else's grief. We're seeing other families if we work in healthcare, and so to not say, oh well, that can't be right, or she can't be healthy. This can't be a healthy form of grief because it doesn't look like person A. Don't worry about it. So our fourth stage is bargaining, which is struggling to find meaning, asking for inappropriate or impossible exchanges of things, right? Bargaining, that's what we think. I always think barter pay, right? Like if I give you something, you give me something. In that stage of grief, we kind of say, well, why couldn't it be me? Or what if I did this? Or I can do this to get this person back? Or, whatever it may be. And that's a very generic example. But looking at that stage of bargaining and struggling to find that meaning of this process for you, that grief process. And lastly, in these 5 stages is acceptance. It's accepting the death, accepting the experience, the journey, and moving forward through that. So again, we've got denial, anger, depression, bargaining, and acceptance. And those are the 5 stages that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross states. Like I said, that's just one version of the stages of grief, or points of grief or journeys of grief, that you can take as a step into understanding what you might be feeling. But please don't stop there. If you're like, yes, oh my God, I feel these 3, but not these 2, hit Google, really take yourself to look what's online, your resources. There's a lot of stuff out there that can help you. And so for today, I wanted to finish with my personal 6th stage. There's different people, different psychologists and practitioners that identify additional stages of grief. Like I said, there's 7 cycles and there's 10 stages. I always think that empowerment should be the 6th stage. Different practitioners have identified resiliency as that missing secret last step, which I think is a huge part of empowerment, is finding that resiliency. But empowerment is that next thing after acceptance, because remember, we're not linear in this process. So I can't say, well, I've accepted, I'm good to go. Right? I'm perfect. I went through my 5 stages. I'm no longer grieving. Great. Grief is going to be a lifetime experience, and that's not in a bad way. We can grieve and have wonderful memories as our grieving process is that journey. I can think of a loved one that I've had pass, and that be part of my grief, but I have it be a wonderful memory, this beautiful experience. So don't think you hit acceptance and you're done. Right? Or you hit whatever stage and you're done. I think that following up with empowerment is kind of that continued swirling through that wave that we talked about, feeling, right? I'm going to empower myself to get through this stage, or I'm going to empower myself to get through today. I'm going to empower myself to go see friends. I'm going to empower myself to read this book. And get out of bed and make a cup of coffee, or whatever you need to do on the smallest scale to the biggest scale that you are working on in your life. Like I said, this grief is not, okay, well, I grieved a year. That's what hospice and bereavement covered. My 13 months, I should be good. It's not the case. Hospice has that benefit for 13 months for you to go through that year, including the anniversary of the death, right, of your loved one or your friend, and to have that support the whole time. But that 13 months doesn't mean you're done. And like I said, I don't say that to scare you and think, oh my God, I'm going to have this grief my whole life. It's going to be there, but it doesn't have to be there in the most difficult and trying times. But being aware of the kind of grief you're going through, and knowing that it's not wrong, and knowing that you don't look like anyone else's journey or timeline is the biggest place to start. And so with that, in our 10 minutes, I hope this was helpful today. If you have any topics or anything that you'd like me to go over or for us to discuss in the coming weeks, please send me a message on Facebook or Instagram. You can email me at energydancehealing@gmail.com. I'm Molly Arney, and I will see you next Tuesday.